Access Unfiltered podcast. It is the 5th most planted grape in the world, the most planted white wine grape in California, and yet it feels like everyone kind of hates Chardonnay. I don't get it. I love Chardonnay. I don't know what the deal is, but I feel like the world is out to get Chardonnay, and we are talking about its reputation in the wine world and why it could really use the help of some PR to spin it around, because I've got some theories on why this is the case, but you should definitely be loving Chardonnay more than you already are. And chances are, those of you who claim to hate Chardonnay actually might secretly love it. More on that in a second. But in the interest of keeping in the theme with making you the savviest wine buyer you can be out there in the wild, we're tackling this very misunderstood grape greatness that is Chardonnay, in the hopes that you can roam the aisles and find exactly what kind of Chardonnay you might like to drink, because there's a lot of different ways to enjoy Chardonnay. There's more than one way to eat a Reese's, as they say. So we're going to navigate that. And with me to help is we'll call you a newcomer, but you're not like super, super new, but Cokie of Cokie's World of Wine. She's a wine blogger, sommelier, a wine student, and she's brought along 300,000 plus of her closest friends for the ride on Instagram as she makes her way toward a dual certification of Master of Wine and Master of Sommelier. I'm effing exhausted just watching you. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Yeah, thanks for having me.
How old are you? Can we say your age?
Yeah. So I'm 23.
She a baby.
Yeah, that's it.
She a baby. I love it. No, it's great. I was definitely not blind tasting when I was 23. I was doing all blind tasting, nothing but blind tasting, because I didn't know ever what was in my glass. So so you're way ahead of me on that. And I also love that you're in the wine influencer sphere. How do you feel about the word? Are you pro influencer, or like you're not into it?
You know, I do think that the word itself, someone who has influence, is accurate, I would say. But when it comes to using it in what the reputation of the word, I'm not a big fan. I think for me, people just have I follow this account called Influencers in the Wild, and it's just people doing silly things, like for the camera. And I definitely don't relate to that. So I think, it's technically true, but I really don't use that word. I like to clarify and say more like wine education. And I don't know. How do you feel about it?
I feel like Chardonnay and influencer are like kind of related in this weird way, right? Like there's so many bad examples of both that it's sort of usurped like the, what it actually means. But I was speaking last week in Paso at this wine conference about social media and wine influencers. And one of the points that I made was like, I asked everyone in the audience, raise your hand if you think influencer is a bad word or has a negative connotation. And at first everyone was like kind of shy about raising their hands. And then I was like, it's okay. Like you can tell me. And like the whole room was like anti-influencer. And then I put up a slide of Robert Parker, Becky Wasserman, and Kermit Lynch. And I was like, we have a very long history of wine influencers in our world. And these guys are all wine influencers. They've just influenced in different ways. So I think the word has sort of like taken on this very interesting definition because of some others who have, as you said, influencers in the wild is a great example.
Do it for the gram.
But I love what you're doing. I think it's super fun. You have brought along people for the journey, but it like kind of started as just like a way to like help your parents, friends or something. Did I read that?
Yeah, exactly. I just I was learning all this cool stuff in wine class, and I thought I gotta, share this. So I started in little videos for my parents and their friends, and I never imagined it would take off, but yeah.
Here you are.
You never know.
And climbing.
Here we are.
And climbing, which is great. So what's on the agenda? You've been traveling a lot, and you're like in between trips right now?
Yeah, in between, and sort of starting. I don't have any exams until next year, so developing a study plan to really nail those well is kind of what I'm up to now, and try and study.
And what are you at now?
So I'm going to the advanced course for the Court of Master Sommeliers for people listening, and that's the third level of the 4. And so that you have to take the course before you go to the exam, which would be early next year. So that's one part of it. And then the second thing that I'm preparing for is the Master of Wine exam. So hopefully I'll be admitted this summer, and then the first exam will be next spring/summer. So two really big exams that I want to nail. So I've got to start studying now, and a great study plan is the key to doing well, is what I've learned along my way. So I've got to get that in place. So I kind of have a month or so now to really nail it in and make sure that week by week and day by day I have everything lined out.
And are you working as a som right now?
No, not on the floor right now.
Are you going to go back to it, you think, or no?
I think I will before the exam, just because it's part of the exam next year. But previously, I was at the Four Seasons, which was pretty cool. I like the high level of service and we remember last time that you like ice in your water, but your husband doesn't. So here we go. We have it. Or you don't even say it. You just do it. I love it. I love being that level. So yeah.
I always loved working at places where you could get to know the guests a little bit and have, different kinds of experiences within the realm of one night. But it's so fun. I assume, have you seen The Bear?
Yeah, I've seen bits of it. I haven't watched the whole thing. What do you think?
I love it, but there's a great episode in there in season 2 where the cousin goes and works, he stages at what's supposed to be basically a 3 Michelin starred restaurant. I think they filmed it at Ever in Chicago, which is Curtis Duffy's place. And it kind of shows you all of those like back end things of like, researching your guests and like going above and beyond and like remembering little things and those like surprise and delight moments that we all enjoy in the restaurant. But I miss those moments. I don't miss being on the floor for all the other moments, but
chaos. I got so many concussions working at the Four Seasons too, from like running into the bartender around the corner.
Is that a reflection of working service, or is that just you? Because I feel like
I just like to move fast. Everyone tells me I do everything too quickly, and I think that my time on the floor is no different. Of course, I'm not running across the floor, but behind the scenes, like if you order some wine, it'll be there soon.
All right. Well, we've got some Chardonnay to drink. I didn't even ask you. Do you like Chardonnay?
I like everything, to be honest. I am not picky. I just find myself observing all the time. Yeah, I do. Yeah.
All right. Well, good. I'm glad.
You?
Because that would have been a really uncomfortable conversation if you didn't.
I mean, that would be uncomfortable for me in my life if I didn't like Chardonnay too.
I mean, there are grapes that I don't necessarily enjoy, but I drink because you got to do it. But no, I love Chardonnay. When people ask me what my desert island like grape is, it's Chardonnay, because as we're going to discuss, it's made in so many different ways that like if you have to pick one, it's a pretty good pick. So, all right, we're going to jump into the second. Before we get there, let's talk about what's going on in the wine world. Okay. We have to start with Florida, which I love Florida. I love visiting Florida. Governor DeSantis, politics aside, has done something great for the state of Florida, which I didn't even know was missing from the state of Florida. We have these very weird wine laws all across the country. All the states have different things. I'm sure you're in Canada. I'm sure you've experienced the same thing, right?
We have lots of wild things going on in Ontario.
Yeah. One of these things in the state of Florida was they did not have super large format bottles until a few days ago. So they would go all the way up to about 3 liters. And now Governor DeSantis has just signed in to law that you can have 4.5, 6, 9, 12, and 15 liter glass bottles. So that's exciting. I feel like that's a weird law to have.
Like you couldn't sell them there?
I guess not. No, I guess like the deal. Yeah. Those are also like, as you know, those are not bottles that you often see in stores, but it's
no. And for listeners, they're not really like, we're not talking bulk wine here. We're talking like, right. We're talking not fine wine necessarily, but fun party bottles. Like you may go to a huge luxurious party and they might have a 15-liter bottle of champagne and they have a whole device to help pour it on a like crank and everything. It's really cool. So it's a fun celebratory thing.
Yeah, no, excellent point. We love champagne in big bottles. That's like the ideal way to enjoy champagne.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me that like this was like of all the things to rectify in the wine world, on the law front, like this was the one that they chose, but like I'll take it.
We got to take what we can get.
We got to take it what we can get. So, Governor DeSantis, I appreciate this one thing that you've done for the wine world.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next. Very big news coming out of Napa. I know we actually met in person for the very first time in Napa when we had drinks at the Charter Oak.
Good things happen in Napa.
Good things happen in Napa. I lived there for many, many years. One of the things that has just happened, which is very interesting and very big news coming out of there, is Trinchero Family Estates has just partnered with David Abreu. David Abreu is probably the most famous viticulturist in Napa Valley. Like he is very well known for being the guy who plants and farms vineyards like Spotswood, Harlan, Bryant family, like all the big 100-point wines that we all know and want to collect and drink. He's the guy that plants them. In fact, we were actually just talking recently, like if you were to go into Napa Valley and start a winery, like you would probably hire David Abreu to plant your vineyard, Flea Balka to make your wine, and Howard Backen to build your winery. Like those are the three names that kind of go together. Anyway, David Abreu has always been a very famous viticulturist, and he has his own label that this guy Brad Grimes makes, and it's wonderful wine, delicious wine that I'm a huge fan of, single site, single vineyard. But they have famously been, wines that like that's all they do. Like they don't Brad doesn't consult on any other wines. This is like the focus of that one project. And this is the very first time that I've ever seen David actually partner with another winery and Brad kind of come along for the ride. So Brad is actually going to be consulting on this project for Trinchero Family Wines, which, and here's sort of the punchline of all of this, Trinchero, you may not know by name, but you definitely know by some of the wines that they make. So they're very famous for some of their brands, including Sutter Home, Neyer's Vineyards, Menage a Trois, which I'm sure many people have seen, Joel Gott Wines. These guys are really kind of making a play to include more high-end wine in their portfolio, but they've traditionally been on like the non-luxury side of things, and now this is their move.
And it's not an April Fool's joke.
It's not an April Fool's joke. Yes. Thank you for asking. Because when I mentioned this to you earlier, you're like, no, is this April Fool's? Because we're filming this on April 1st. Not an April Fool's joke. No, this is real. This is actually happening. And I think it's a little bit of a signal for Napa Valley, right? Like, I think you're going to start seeing like Trinchero is Napa based and they don't have a higher end division. But I will be curious to see like if this does anything for the rest of the portfolio because they really have not had any high-end wines, though I have heard that their tasting experience is quite nice. Have you ever visited that property, that winery?
No, but I have been someone recommended that I go there because of the experience. So
Yeah.
interesting.
I've heard good things. Where do you like to taste in Napa? You've tasted a few places.
I like a mix of things. I like to go to new places every time I go back, but highlights include Steve Mathiasen for sure. He's just like the coolest. I like to meet, some like people who are interested in different areas, some big, some small. So yeah, he's probably been my favorite, most exciting hangout so far.
I love that. Steve's very cool.
Yeah.
Steve and Jill are very cool.
Yeah, totally.
Big guy.
And the tomatoes. You gotta really like nail down your visit time for what vegetables and fruits you like because they grow them all.
So pro tip. Yeah. Pro tip. Yeah. Tomato season, summertime.
No, they're so sweet and just so exciting what they're doing. So it's a cool different perspective on Napa.
Yeah. For those who don't know Mathiasen, Steve Mathiasen got very famous at least within the valley because he was actually the very first to take a high-end vineyard fully biodynamic. So he took the Isley Vineyard, which was then under the stewardship of the Arajos. He took that biodynamic, and that's been continued by those that own it now. But their personal project is they focus on minimalist winemaking, minimal intervention farming, biodynamic farming, regenerative farming, and then their grape varieties are very interesting. So they use a lot of like things that you would not expect in Napa Valley, like Rabola Jala, and he makes vermouth and very delicious Cabernet, but like in like a very crunchy sort of old world style. Did you have a favorite wine when you visited?
I really like the vermouth, not technically a wine, but But that was awesome. I think it's you feel like you're in Sonoma sometimes when you're hanging out with him. You're like, this is too like fun. Not that Napa's not fun, but it's like it's too crazy and exciting and I don't know, sort of rogue to feel like it's Napa, but he's pushing everyone to be a little more experimental. So I think that's really cool.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of experimentation happening in Napa Valley, mostly because it's not economical to do so, but we
Yeah.
appreciate
When
Steve
you can.
Matthias.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right. Well, we're gonna jump into all things Chardonnay in just a second, but this is your gentle but friendly reminder to make sure that you are subscribed to this podcast. Make sure that you, if you're watching this on YouTube, that you like this video. And also, because we're going to be yanking out a wine for you guys to enjoy with us in the next segment, this is your cue to join the Wine Access Unfiltered Wine Club podcast. Wine Club. I always get this wrong. It is the longest name for a wine club in wine club history, but it's 4 bottles every 2 months. I pick them and they're delicious and they go with every single episode. So 1 wine per episode and you get to drink with us today. If you are a member already, we're going to be drinking the Adelsheim, which is a Chardonnay coming from the Chehalem Mountains in the Willamette Valley. And if you're going to be joining us, make sure you put that in either your all-purpose glass or grab a burgundy glass if you've got it. All right, we'll see you guys in just a second. All right, Cokie. Cheers.
Dante.
Santé. We love this. Should we blind? We're not blind, but should we like officially taste this wine or are you exhausted?
You want to run through the grid?
Let's go through the grid before we even talk about this. Let's go
All
for the
right.
grid. Hit it.
Oh, me. Okay.
Yeah. I haven't done this shit in years.
Okay, I'm going with a modified grid, convenient grid,
Okay.
weekend grid. This wine is clear. It's a white wine. It's kind of like I would say medium yellow with some golden reflections, if anything, more golden than green.
Mm-hmm.
There's no evidence of gas or sediment. And I'm not really going to get into viscosity today. We can talk about alcohol later. Viscosity is the tiers, the amount of tiering. And
Yep.
everybody, viscosity and the legs on your wine do not indicate quality.
Correct. It indicates viscosity, which
That's
is a
a myth.
measure of either sugar or alcohol. These are like
Yes.
moderate tiers. They're just moderate. They're like falling
Moderate.
relatively slowly. This is a 12.5% alcohol wine. There is no residual sugar in this. Like we said, this is falling right in that
Moderate.
moderate category.
Yeah.
Nose.
On the nose, the wine is clean, meaning no fault that we're getting, at least for me.
Nope.
And there's a good amount of intensity, kind of like medium plus to pronounced intensity. And it's this beautiful yellow fruits, kind of like lemons and
You get like golden apples in there.
yeah, golden. It's very yellow and golden, and I really like to use colors, kind of like
Same.
pie crust and like some pastries.
Mm-hmm.
Really beautiful. There's a creamy element, almost like lemon icing on a cupcake.
What's that? There's like a frosted lemon dessert that I'm thinking of that it kind of reminds me of. I don't know what it's called, but like you kind of see it in you can get it at like gas stations sometimes. I'm sure somebody listening out there will be like raising their hand, but almost like a lemon loaf, right? Like you maybe
Yeah,
get
like
it at,
lemon.
Starbucks.
It's very
The iced
yellow.
lemon
Like
loaf.
you wouldn't
Yes.
I wouldn't be using red or green to describe this wine at all. It's yellow and golden to me.
Yeah, agreed.
And is there evidence of oak? You know, there's definitely something that's like warm and creamy going on. So whether that's from Mallow, I think I think there definitely is some oak, but it's not like an oaky Chardonnay, I would say.
Correct.
It's very well integrated and complex. So complexity is an indication of quality. We're impressed on the nose.
We
Now
like
move on to the palate.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I really like when wines are kind of just like all in one and you don't feel the different elements sticking out. It's really balanced. So this wine is super balanced. Yeah, I appreciate the alcohol not being super high, which we see often these days. So 12.5 is a nice area to be in.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, the acidity is kind of like moderate plus, and it's got some beautiful length. So I didn't really touch on everything there, but
That was great. And I think all the things that you mentioned on the nose are continuing onto the palate.
Yeah,
Sometimes like you
absolutely.
have like completely different things that happen, but again, like continuing with that, those all those golden sort of yellow things going on. And we're going to talk about why this is important. No one at home needs to do what we just did, but this is how we assess wines. And I think it's important
Yeah.
because Chardonnay is one of those wines that can go in a lot of different directions. We actually did an entire episode on Chardonnay with Dan Petrosky last season. I highly recommend going back and listening to because there's a lot of really great points that he makes coming from the winemaker's perspective about the grape and why it behaves the way that it does. One of the things that he had mentioned is that number one, the parent of Chardonnay wasn't very noble. It was just sort of like this yellow water, so it didn't really come from noble beginnings. But the other thing that he mentioned is that when you're dealing with white wines, you are not dealing with the skins. The winemaker is just pressing the grape and they're extracting the juice. And so there's really no contact. And why that's important is the skins are really the skins are taking on all of the climactic elements. So they're taking on the wind, they're taking on the sun, they're taking on everything that they would experience in terms of weather pattern. But what it is picking up is all of the terroir from the soil. So what you're tasting in the wine is 50% of the DNA. So, what the grape would normally do, as the Chardonnay grape does. And we'll talk about what those things are in a second. But 50% soil terroir. So, it's really picking up what is in the soil. And then, of course, you have all of the other things that go into it on the winemaking side. And Chardonnay really is called the winemaker's grape. Now,
Hmm.
the soil on this particular wine, this is important. And the fact that this is coming from the Chehalem Mountains, this is the Adelsheim Staking Claim Chardonnay. It's a 2019 vintage, so it's still fairly young, but it's
As the wine develops on my palate,
mhm,
we're noticing that age on the wine. So this wine's about 4.5 years old,
mhm.
and normally, well, some wines they'll show that right away on the nose, but this one seemed pretty fresh and youthful. But on the palate, it's turning to sort of like white mushroom and a little bit moist, a little bit like wet stoniness.
Mm.
And for me, the white mushroom is a characteristic of Chardonnay as it's a little bit older. So I would definitely wouldn't be in the super young camp for this. I think 2019 is pretty much what it's tasting like.
Yeah,
But it's
excellent
developed
point.
into that aged aroma, which is an indication that it can continue to age for longer too.
Totally. Yeah, when we're
Yeah.
thinking about the ageability of wines, it's always really difficult to extrapolate out and figure out exactly how long a wine can age. But I would say, based on how this is doing now, to your point, like it's developing nicely into things like white mushroom and it's not getting into these like kind of baked apple, like, some of those like those mushy pie characteristics that can sort of happen with like especially Chardonnays made in hot climates.
Hmm.
I love that it's developing in this way. But
Yeah.
in terms of soil, so this wine has really picked up some of the soil in here. There's a lot of volcanic soil, and there's a lot of like marine sediment. So you're getting a
Hmm.
ton of salinity, and you're getting a ton of that like almost that like minerality is one of these words that we don't always love to throw around, but you are getting a lot of like minerality on
Like wet
the
rocks.
like what rocks, yeah,
Yeah.
like river stones or something like that. Like I'm
Yeah.
working on planting all of my like garden stuff right now. I'm like bringing in rocks and things like that, and like that's kind of what this reminds me of. Is like
Hmm.
there's like this like fresh rain quality. That's
Yes.
really delicious. So
Especially on the
this
finish, I think. The fruit is still
totally
really powerful in the nose, but like the finish is all mineral.
Totally. And this is
Yeah.
coming from Oregon, which I don't know how much Oregon Chardonnay you've had, but I think I've like waxed poetic about Oregon Chardonnay way too many times in this podcast. But I'm obsessed with Oregon Chardonnay. It's the land of Pinot, but I think more recently you're seeing a lot more Chardonnay come out of these parts. And
Hmm.
what you're seeing is what I would call somewhere between the old world and the new world. Like you're getting the best of both worlds in this glass. This was aged in, it was fermented and aged in 1/3 New French oak. Again, we're going to get into why all this is important in a second. And then it was put in stainless steel tanks a year later. So, kind of going back to all of the things that Cokie correctly identified in this glass.
Ooh,
Congratulations. Whoop, whoop.
thank you.
So, when we're talking about Chardonnay at its core, I mentioned 50% DNA at its core. There are some markers, and I'm sure Cokie knows what they are, as do I. So for me, it's like orchard fruit and citrus fruit are kind of the camps that I live in. Would you add anything else to that?
Yeah, I think that when it ages, it tends to develop, like for me, white mushroomy characteristics.
Mm,
And also Chardonnay is just kind of like what it's not too. It's not other
mm,
aromas that you would find in other grapes. And so that's kind of a giveaway for Chardonnay for me. And then not many white wines see oak. So when you get
yes.
oak in a white wine, Chardonnay must be in the forefront or, up there in your possibilities.
True. Yeah. And that is the thing that has sort of separated Chardonnay from all the other categories and has sort of given it the reputation that it has. Um, so things that would indicate to you that maybe this wine has seen oak are all of your baking spices. You mentioned pie
Hmm.
crust, vanilla, cardamom, cloves, cinnamon. Those are all things that would indicate new French oak. Now, what's important here, and I think the text sheet is actually really helpful in this wine because it gives you just enough information if you know what to look for. When you see that it's only a third new French oak and then finished in stainless, you can pretty much guarantee that you're not going to get any of those flavors. So the fact that you are getting just a little bit of a whisper on here is totally normal. When you see that a Chardonnay has been done in 100% new French oak and it's been aged for months and months or even years and years, that's when you can basically determine before you even open the bottle that it's going to taste oaky. So it's going to have all of that vanilla, butterscotch, all of that like intense sort of like croissanty feel to it. That's when you can assume that that's what's going to be inside the bottle. And that's, to me, when you're looking at the descriptors for wines, Chardonnay is really, really helpful. I know you mentioned you like Chardonnay. You're 23, your cohort, do they drink Chardonnay? What is the feeling around Chardonnay?
Um, I get asked this all the time about my cohort.
Your cohort.
I mean
What are
that's the
the
first
young
one.
kids
First,
drinking?
yeah, people that's what people ask. It's I think that it really depends. I don't know. I don't think I've really heard that someone my age say to me that I really love Chardonnay specifically. Um, I think they're still figuring it out. If you look at people in the wine scene, obviously they are, but for most people, they're just so a huge generalization, but a lot of my friends would be just starting to think about wine in
Mm,
general and still maybe even in that some of my friends are still in the sweet wine era. So I don't know. I think Chardonnay is something that I'll be introducing to my friends in the next 2 to 5 years.
okay. And what will you be introducing first? Like a region or style?
It really depends where they're coming from. So how experimental. You don't want to scare people away with the big oaky Chardonnays if that's not what they're into,
Mm,
because it can be jarring, and that's why you hear people say, "I don't like Chardonnay."
yes.
And Chardonnay is so you can't not like Chardonnay. I think. I think that I have heard people say that there's some lees characteristic they don't like, but and I totally believe people know what they like and everything, but I think there's so much misconception about what Chardonnay tastes like. So there you have like I don't think there's another grape that can be so polarizing. You have Chablis style, unoaked, crisp, like could be mistaken for Riesling or any crisp white wine Pinot Grigio style, and then you have this like huge, rich, like golden, you know, baking spice bomb, and that's like doing the splits. I don't know if there's another grape. So to say Chardonnay as one thing, it's so difficult because
Yes.
it's so versatile. So I don't know.
I
I
agree.
would have to do case by case basis, but there's just so much with Chardonnay.
Okay, so here's the deal with Chardonnay, right? So the rise of Chardonnay's popularity happened long before I entered the wine equation. So in the 70s and 80s, Chardonnay got incredibly popular in the US as the US wine regions were trying to emulate what was being done in France. And France was the benchmark. You see that all across history when it comes to wine. That winemakers were not only trying to make those same grapes, they were trying to make them in those same styles. But obviously, being in California, that was a little bit difficult to make a Burgundian Chardonnay. And so
Mhm.
what happened was you saw big producers start to make very rich, full bodied, oaky Chardonnays, and people loved them. They got very, very popular. And Chardonnay, up until the mid 90s, was actually the most planted grape in Napa Valley before it was superseded by Cabernet Sauvignon. Today, America's number one selling Chardonnay in the US is Kendall Jackson Vintners Reserve. For 30 years, that has been the most popular brand of Chardonnay, which is a very rich, very oaky Chardonnay. And one thing that I will say about Kendall Jackson, because we have to talk a little bit about the styles and how these wines are made. As we talk about Chardonnay in this style, one thing that you definitely don't want to do, and this kind of like plays into this like how to be a savvy wine buyer, the one thing that you don't want to do is if you go into a wine shop and you want a rich, oaky, buttery Chardonnay, you should be spending about $20 plus. Because if you're not, there's a high likelihood that there is synthetic flavoring in those wines in that sub $20 category. They probably use oak chips or liquid oak or something like that. And for some people, that's not always a pleasant reaction. The exception to that rule is Kendall Jackson Vintners Reserve. And I don't know if you know this, but they actually physically barrel ferment all of their Chardonnay in actual new French oak barrels. They do lees stirring, they do batonnage, and they age it in real French oak barrels. And it's like a $15 wine, which is crazy. So there is an
Wow.
exception to that rule. Yeah, I went there, I saw it, it's
Yeah.
real.
Wow.
I was blown away.
How many barrels do they have in there?
Thousands.
Yeah.
It's a popular Chardonnay, so they make quite a bit of it. But and this is kind of, when people talk about big corporations making wines, these are the kinds of things that we always fail to mention because scale and vertical integration can really lend itself to
Hmm.
having better quality across this. If somebody were to try to make an oaky, buttery Chardonnay today, they wouldn't be able to do so with all the correct equipment and do it for less than about $30. It's just too expensive.
Because the oak barrels cost between 1,500 and
Ex- exactly.
$33,000 US. So
Exactly.
that
And
is
there's
expensive.
man labor that goes into it. They can't just put it into a tank and add,
No.
oak chips. That's not, you
And that's
can, but
like a whole cost that just so that you are using real oak barrels as opposed to oak chips or something that you add
exactly.
on. And so if you think about it eating away at the profits, it's
So, interestingly, the reputation of Chardonnay has sort of taken a beating over the past 20 years as people have sort of shied away from this style of Chardonnay that has become so popular via brands like, Behringer, Kendall Jackson, these really popular American brands. But as we have sort of teased about leading up to this is not the only style of Chardonnay that's out there. And the one that's in your glass, if you're drinking with us, is representative of how versatile Chardonnay can be. It is produced all across the globe in many different regions.
pretty much every region.
Pretty much every region makes Chardonnay because you can do it like pretty well. Like, depending on where you
Yeah.
are, there it's not that difficult to do. You probably have had Chardonnay and probably have liked Chardonnay and just didn't know it. So if you've ever had a glass of champagne and loved it, there's a high probability that you have had Chardonnay. If you've ever had a glass of Chablis and loved it, you had Chardonnay. If you've ever had any white Burgundy for that matter and loved it, you have had Chardonnay. It is produced all across the globe in many different ways, and it's pretty likely that you've had it and liked it. So we can't be writing off grapes like this. We have to
Hmm.
take into consideration where they're from, who made them, and of course the age of the wine. Um, if you walk into a store and go to the French section, um, and you go looking for a white wine, there's a high probability that it will be Chardonnay that you are going to be drinking. Two of the most popular regions in France are Champagne and Burgundy, and that is their flagship grape for both. There are other places that also make Chardonnay outside of those places. Cokie, what are some of your favorite regions?
Oh, I think that the Willamette Valley is really exciting. We
Yeah.
have a distinct style coming from Napa Valley that's kind of a high quality, oakier, richer style, benchmark style for sure. Where else? I really liked some from the California, the cooler coast. So like Santa Barbara area, very much in this sort of style that we have here,
Mhm.
where it's kind of like a medium, lightly oaked, but it really depends on who's making it. Australia, some cool stuff.
Yes.
New Zealand always has cool stuff. Yeah, I think pretty much everywhere you just need someone cool doing things, with love and care, and you can have some great Chardonnay.
I agree. I think all of those regions are definitely regions to look for in terms of style because, obviously you don't know until you get into the bottle what a wine is going to taste like for real. But there's a few things that you can look for to sort of indicate that.
Hmm.
One of those things is going to be climate. So if you see a Chardonnay coming from Napa Valley, there's a pretty good chance that that wine is going to be on the richer side. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be oaky, but a lot of times those producers go for that because those wines are bigger by themselves and they often need a little bit of oak to kind of soften them up to bring out some of those flavor characteristics. So if you see a wine that's coming from a warmer climate, there's a pretty good indication that it's going to have those ripe flavors and it's going to have oak on it. But you can always look in the back a lot of the labels or check out, pull up the winery website to see like, was it barrel fermented? Was it done in stainless steel? Was it done in concrete? You can look all of those things up to sort of discern whether or not that's going to be the case. You can
Hmm.
also take a peek at alcohol. It's not always going to be the easiest thing to tell, but 12.5% alcohol is generally key that this is a cooler-ish climate wine and that the alcohol is going to be lower and that richer style is not going to be present. Um, Other places that I would be looking, you mentioned Australia, Tasmania and Margaret River in Australia are two of the most incredible places, and they make styles that I would say are more in this like sort of Oregon style, like it's ripe but not super ripe, like it's somewhere between
Hmm.
Oregon and California, depending on the producer. Um, the other thing that we have to talk about is the fact that it's not always going to say Chardonnay on the label. At what point in your career did you realize that Chablis was not a grape and that it was a region?
Pretty early on because it's really common in my house. Um,
Oh,
yeah,
lucky
it's a
you.
common one. Well, not me, my mom. She's a really
Okay.
big Chablis lover. So it's tough. How would you know, right? How would you
How would
know?
you
And
know?
and you have all these French words on bottles. I think we could also potentially talk about bottle shape.
Yeah.
You often will find Chardonnay in a bottle that's, more
Burgundy bottle.
sort of gradually getting larger in size as you move to the bottom, whereas some other French white wines that don't have Chardonnay will have sort of like square top shoulders,
Mm-hmm.
rectangular ones from like Bordeaux kind of style. So that's also a helpful indication if it's not saying what the grape is. But I don't
Good
know.
call.
I think that in France, I don't even know that it is about, it's not really about the grape. It's about the land and it's about the
Yes.
style and the history there. So I kind of, I think they understand that Chardonnay is so, it's like a blank canvas and it depends on the history and the traditions there and the climate. And that's what you're seeing as opposed to the grape. Chardonnay doesn't really have that much of its own flavor. And so that richer style is pretty much due to oak. I don't
Yeah.
know. So if you don't
Yeah.
like Chardonnay, you probably just don't like oak.
Yeah, but you might like
And
Chablis.
yeah,
And the only thing you
Chablis
have
is
to be
kind of
careful with,
unhateable.
it
Like
is unhateable. The only
it's
thing you have
so
to be careful with
lovable.
Chablis is that, like, on the petite Chablis side, basically up to like Premier Cru, they're mostly unoaked. But when you get to Grand
Yeah,
Cru level, that
they
is
can
when,
be.
so when that is when you
Yeah,
can see some like, richer styles of Chablis. They're still lean and racy, but they have a bigger mouthfeel. So I always just like to caveat that because if you're spending
yes,
more than like
it's a good
$100
one.
in a bottle of Chablis, there's a pretty good chance that it's going to be rich. Also, we have to talk about malolactic fermentation very quickly, which is this conversion of lactic acid to malic acid. So lactic acid is, this green apple. It's what makes you feel like very zigzaggy. If you ever had like a glass of Sauvignon Blanc or Pinot Grigio, those all have a ton of malic acid. It has that very zigzaggy feel to it. There's this natural conversion or fermentation, secondary fermentation that happens that converts that malic acid to lactic acid, which is a creamier, it's lactic acid, think like milk, creamier, softer feel. And this is where you're getting those buttery compounds. So there is this compound that comes out of that process called diacetyl, and that's where you're getting that sort of buttered popcorn feel. Interestingly, in Chablis, more and more Chablis goes through malolactic fermentation than we realize. So it has this, like, even though it's lean and racy, it does have a creamier mouthfeel. And that's sort of a misconception that I think people,
Totally. Like pretty much all of them do go through mallow.
yeah, they go through mallow because the acids are so high. So, this is one of those things that you can always ask, like, did this go through mallow? Sometimes it'll be full mallow, sometimes it'll be partial mallow. And it could indicate depending on that response, it could indicate that, yeah, there's going to be some of those like buttery flavors. But in Chablis, a lot of them go through it and they don't necessarily have it on there. So that's not universal in that way. But I think it's an important distinction that if you see it on the text sheet, like full mallow warm climate, probably going to have that like, a little bit of that like popcorny, that like kind of buttery feel. This one doesn't,
Mhm.
it didn't say whether this went
It kind
through
of tastes like
mallow.
mallowy to me.
I think it went through at
It's
least
quite
partial mallow in
creamy
here. It is creamy. And I think like to me,
and that
there's
golden
definitely,
character too.
yeah, and it's you can get that butteriness, but to me it's more about that texture, right? That like
Hmm.
that creaminess, that roundness. And that's where like, Chardonnay for me is so superior because you can have all of these flavors, but then texturally it's so interesting and it's so layered. And then then you bring champagne into the equation, which is, a lot of Chardonnay is used to make champagne, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier as well. But um, that's where like texture, I think Chardonnay is such an interesting grape. I don't know about you, but like Chardonnay is my like go-to cheese wine whenever I've got like cheese on
Oh
the
yeah.
table. It's Chardonnay for me, unless it's goat cheese, in which it's Sauvignon Blanc.
Yeah, I think Chardonnay just doesn't have many clashing flavors, and that's why it's so versatile in the winery. Like other grapes just have aromas that would clash with the oak, where Chardonnay is just like, bring it on.
Bring it on, let's do
Chardonnay's
it.
like the
Yeah.
best party guest, just so friendly, versatile. We'll get along with everyone.
I mean, depending on how to say it, but like Chardonnay really gets a bad rap. Like, you hear a lot of people hate on like, I hate Chardonnay. I hate Chardonnay. It's like, you
Anything
probably
but
don't.
Chardonnay.
Anything but
Like,
Chardonnay. Like,
oh man.
you hear it all the time. I'm sure you get to people tell you in the DMs, like, I don't like Chardonnay. Like, what else should I try? And
Yeah,
you're like, oh,
sometimes they do, and I think it's too bad. In the wine world, there's just so many scary things, and you get scared easily, and people are sharing all these misconceptions, and it's of course you would think you don't like Chardonnay because you just had a Chardonnay yesterday and you didn't like it. So why wouldn't you say you don't like Chardonnay?
yeah,
But when you actually break it down and learn about it, there's Chardonnay so lovable, and the best we can do is tell people and educate, and
that's right.
yeah.
Yeah. So, I think Chardonnay is one of those grapes that you should spend a little bit of money on. It's not like Sauvignon Blanc or Pinot Grigio where you can be in that sub $20 category and have a great day. There are exceptions. There are some very good Chardonnays, especially in the lean style that we're talking about in that sub 20, but mostly if you want
Yeah.
that richer style, you should be spending a little bit more. It's a terrible wedding wine if you don't have the budget for it. If you've got the budget for like really good Chardonnay, absolutely do it. But like, as a party wine in that sub $20 category, don't do it. Same goes for like ordering on planes and economy. If it's a Chardonnay option, don't do it. If it came from a jug, there's a high probability that like oak chips or like liquid oak were used to make that, and it's just not good for anybody. We don't like it.
Mm-mm.
Um, but if you do want to splurge on Chardonnay, which I highly, we always talk about the cheap Chardonnay, but there's some really good expensive Chardonnay out there.
I think some of the best white wines in the world are Chardonnay.
Yeah, that's true. That's
Probably the
true.
most expensive ones in the world are Chardonnay. Burgundy must be.
Yeah, I can't think of, well, aside from like the white Haut-Brions, right, which are Sauvignon Semillon, yeah, for the most part, they're all Chardonnays coming
Oh,
from
Burgundy.
Burgundy. There's also like there's Chardonnay produced in northern Italy as well. Like the Gaias make a little Chardonnay. There's some very expensive Chardonnay coming out of more and more. Oregon Chardonnay is getting expensive. So this is like
Hmm.
one of those places that like while you still can get it for like $40, do it.
And you can age it. Usually,
Yes.
if you're spending, I would say over $30 to $35 on a Chardonnay. It's a really big generalization, but you can definitely forget about it for 3 to 5 years for sure.
Yeah. I
And
agree.
sometimes in 20 years, they're still really, really interesting. So
Yeah. And
exciting.
in Napa, you've got some really beautiful examples of expensive Chardonnay there. Kongsgaard is one of the most famous examples of that. The Judge is now like that's like a single little like Ludi plot of Chardonnay. It's very good wine, but Jesus Christ, it's gotten expensive.
What's it at? Like,
The last I looked on secondary market, it was like between 800 and 1200 a bottle.
ooh.
And that's like, if you want to taste like the benchmark, to me, like one of the benchmark Napa Valley, no, the benchmark Napa Valley high end Chardonnay, Kongsgaard. Like they're the ones. But if you want to expand that into Sonoma, you can bring Marcusson into the equation. Like those are two. Marcusson is probably the most well known Sonoma, very rich. That's Helen Turley's brand. Like she kind of like put this style on the map. and those wines will go from anywhere from like $300 to $1,000 a bottle. And they come from a few different vineyard sites across the board. And then you have that like sort of, if we're going to call it mid tier, but like expensive still, like Kistler, Aubert. Those are
Hmm.
all, great examples of premium California Chardonnay that are richer, softer, silkier in style. Somehow we've gotten through this podcast and not talked about Rombauer. Where are we? How do we feel about Rombauer?
I mean, they
Have you
were
ever had
just
it?
sold to a big corporation
Yep. Yep.
recently.
Sold to Gallo.
Dude, how do we feel about that? I don't know. For me, it's kind of, I like when things are owned by smaller entities and
Yeah.
people. But I don't know. Now we can talk about more economies of scale, more equipment, better quality for the price. So it's kind of give and take. Rombauer is definitely an example of that richer style. I always get canned corn with
Yes.
Rombauer.
Canned
Yeah.
corn and the candy corn that you get from on
Yeah.
Halloween too.
Corn.
Yeah. But people love
Chardonnay.
it. Cougar, we call it the cougar juice affectionately, of course.
Affectionately.
Rombauer for dessert is like kind of my vibe. If you want something that tastes like a cookie, like a corn cookie,
Without the
actually,
sugar. Eh,
um,
eh.
there's probably some sugar in
Less
there.
sugar? What do you think? What do you think it's at?
I don't know.
It's a
I would venture there's some. Most wines are dry, right? Like it's interesting. I was like going through Google to find out like what do people Google around Chardonnay, and it was like, is Chardonnay dry or sweet? And hopefully, if you're listening to this podcast for any length of time, you know that like that is not relative to a varietal. Dry and sweet is a style of how you make a wine, and dry is
dry is
obviously the
not sweet.
dry is not sweet. It's the opposite of sweet. Um,
So confusingly. It's just
so
such a silly word.
I agree.
Maybe one day we can change that.
I agree. I'm not a fan of the word dry
Let's just
as the
make
opposite of
everyone
sweet.
feel uncomfortable and like they don't understand what we're talking about.
For
And
sure.
say a
That's just the
silly
wine
word.
world's goal in life. Um, yeah, I think Rombauer has some residual sugar. Like I do think it's a little bit sweet, but
But
it's also
it's not a sweet wine. It's like
no,
meant
no,
to
no.
taste approachable. I think a
Yeah,
little bit of sugar makes things more approachable, but in the sense of where you're talking about a cookie, it's not sweet like a cookie, but it
no,
smells like a cookie. And it might have a
correct,
little bit of approachability, sweetness, but it's like it's not a sweet wine. It just blends right
correct.
in.
And this is a good point because when we talk about sugar, and by the way, we add sugar to champagne not to make it sweet, but to enhance the flavor. Sugar is not a sweetening agent, it's a flavor enhancer in the way that salt is. So it actually helps to just bring out the flavors. So I don't know whether there's residual sugar or not in Rombauer, but it appears to me, based on the viscosity of that wine, how the flavors are perceived, that there is a little bit of sweetness, but it is not, as you said, a sweet wine. It just
Hmm.
makes it a little bit more enjoyable.
You probably won't notice the sweetness in Rombauer. Like you won't go, it's sweet. It's just if you look for it now, you might if there is any.
Yeah. There's the flavors are more pronounced, but
Yeah,
I will drink it. Like I'm full on
it's a
for I'm
style, right?
it's a style. And
It's a style.
so one of the things I wanted to touch on before we leave is like there is this sort of weird stigma in the wine world that liking oaky, buttery Chardonnays is like kind of uncool. And this is sort of what I meant by like, Chardonnay needs like a PR overhaul. Somehow like it got like wrapped up in this like bad association of like I don't know, people just thought it was like not cool to drink oaky buttery Chardonnays. I think maybe because there was some like bad ones made for a while, but there are some very beautiful examples, all of which we just named. And in fact, I have a friend who's maybe listening to this podcast who always makes fun of me because I love drinking Kistler. I will die on that hill. I love drinking Kistler. I think it's delicious. In the same way that like I'm happy to have a glass of Rombauer Chardonnay and
Hmm.
a glass of like very high acid Riesling, but somewhere in there, and I don't know if you've experienced this, it has become uncool to
Yeah.
drink oaky buttery Chardonnay. Have you noticed this in your like wine journeys?
Totally. I've noticed that in the same way where people sort of frown upon, quote, frown upon, but as a wine professional and lover, I don't have anything against sweet wines, especially like there's some really high quality sweet wines coming out of Germany that are
Yeah.
delicious. So, in the same way that some people unwarrantedly frowned upon sweet wines. I think they frown upon Chardonnay that's oaked, or just oaky wines in general. And I think that's as a result of this huge over oaking situation that happened in like the between the 80s and the early 2000s. It really took off, and the wines just became, especially Chardonnays from California, so oaky that it was literally like vanilla juice. And so I think people are still recovering. If you just took that out of the history, I don't think we would have such a thing against oak. But because of that, people are, there's definitely at that point, it was not a respectable wine style, potentially. It was just so oaked and flavored. So I think now, as we start to rein it in more and have more fruit characteristics and just use a lighter hand when it comes to oak, oaky wines are super respectable.
Balance.
Yeah, balance. And especially at the high quality level, there are totally wines that are super oaky and delicious. It's a style.
Yeah, it's a style. And like when a winemaker can do it well, there are a few things that are more pleasurable. So
it's so textural too. Chardonnay has the ability to become like this beautiful, like especially from Burgundy, like it's like silky sheets. Like when you're just got out of a shower and you're just going into silky sheets and you're like, whoa, this is textural.
Yes.
It could be like
Sauvignon Blanc never does that. It's just Chardonnay. Yeah. No, I agree.
Chardonnay.
That's excellent point. Yeah. It's so pleasing on so many levels, and I love drinking it. And as I mentioned, like when people like ask me like what's the grape, like for me it's Chardonnay. Like it's always there for me, and I love it. And I feel like as two wine influencers, we have to help to rehab the image of Chardonnay.
Yeah, it's tough for consumers, right? Like how do you navigate this confusing world of Chardonnay?
Yeah. Well, you can start by looking at the French section and looking for, I love this tip about the bottle shape. That's great. Your
Google bottle shapes, and you can see we're talking about the Bordeaux bottle shape, meaning that pretty much never has Chardonnay in it, Bordeaux bottle shape. And then if you look at the Burgundy bottle shape, then that's pretty much Chardonnay's bottle shape.
Yeah. It's a Burgundy shape. The other thing is like, outside of Chardonnay in France, if it's put in a Burgundy bottle, there's a high likelihood that it is a fuller bodied white wine in general. So like other regions that would produce wines like that are coming from like the Rhone, from the Languedoc.
Totally.
They do stylistically tend to emulate their bottle shape. So, sort of extending beyond just Chardonnay, if you're looking for something that's like Chardonnay adjacent, keep looking for those bottle shapes. Like I think that's great advice right
Even
there.
outside of France, like around the whole world.
Exactly.
Like New World, meaning outside of Europe, producers will pretty much pick their bottle shape based on the style that they're making. So
it's almost like these bottles are like rounder and softer looking, like aesthetically, and that's kind of like emulates the wine. Whereas like the Bordeaux bottle is like it's leaner, it's more narrow,
like a bullet or something.
Exactly. So we can search you there. Hopefully this podcast helps you to navigate the wild intricacies of Chardonnay and turn around its reputation. As always, we invite you to tell us what you think of the podcast via, leaving us a little bit of a review. And if you've got some feedback for us, we're always there for you in the DMs on our Instagram at Wine Access Unfiltered. Cokie, what a pleasure. Where can the people find you?
Oh, they can find me on Instagram at Cokie's World of Wine. And trying to think in the real world, I'm always
traversing around countries, looking at regions.
Traversing.
Yeah. One of these days, our journeys will take us to a region together. Fingers crossed it's New Zealand.
Yeah, fingers crossed on that one.
Yeah.
New Zealand wines. Hello.
New Zealand wines. Yeah. Okay. Well, until then, please continue enjoying all of the Chardonnay. Join us with the Wine Club if you're not there already. All of the information is below in the description. And cheers until next time. Thanks, Cokie.
Cheers.
Cheers.